In 1956, MGM cut an 11-minute scene from Forbidden Planet that was never meant to reach theaters. The scene involved Anne Francis and her pet tiger. Something about innocence, power, and an ancient myth that made censors panic. For decades, only a handful of people knew it existed. The scene explained why the tiger suddenly attacks Altaira after her first kiss, but the explanation was too controversial for 1950s audiences. What MGM buried reveals a dark secret about the film's true meaning. In 1952, two matte painters who had never written a screenplay in their life walked into MGM with a story they called Fatal Planet. Irving Bloch and Alan Adler were not taken seriously. Science fiction back then was considered a dumping ground for low-budget throwaways, a place where studios sent their leftover actors and reused monster suits. But their pitch had something different. It came from two men who didn't think in words, but in images. They saw a planet not just as a place, but as a canvas for fear, awe, silence, and technology. MGM tossed it out at first, but something about it lingered. By 1954, the tide had shifted. Studio heads were no longer ignoring the television boom or the growing curiosity about space. MGM took the gamble and gave it a second look. That dusty pitch got pulled out of a drawer and quietly transformed into what would become Forbidden Planet, one of the most expensive sci-fi experiments of its time. MGM didn't just approve it, they bet on it. Somewhere between $1.9 and $2 million got poured into a genre that usually scraped by with $150,000 to maybe $500,000. The studio wasn't just trying to make a sci-fi flick, they wanted to elevate it. Set designs were built from scratch. The cast wasn't made up of fading B-list stars, but up-and-comers like Leslie Nielsen and Anne Francis, paired with the gravitas of Walter Pidgeon. Every dollar went into turning a genre nobody respected into something people couldn't stop looking at. MGM's decision was bold enough that the industry stood still for a second. Was it a foolish risk or a new future? Even inside MGM, executives whispered about the cost. But the gamble worked. It didn't just make its money back, it changed what science fiction meant to studios, showing them that the stars didn't have to be cheap to shine. Originally, the story was set in the year 1972, but the technology in the script felt too wild, too far-fetched for anything remotely near the real timeline. So they flung the story 200 years forward, landing in the 23rd century on a distant world called Altaira 4. The core plot quietly borrowed from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Dr. Morbius became a futuristic Prospero, stranded with secrets he couldn't control. His daughter Altaira took the place of Miranda. Even the monsters weren't just monsters. They were shaped by the human mind, pulled from the subconscious like Shakespeare's spirits of vengeance. This quiet fusion of high art and pulp genre made the film stand out. It wasn't just lasers and spaceships. It was about power, ego, control, and fear buried so deep inside the brain that even the stars couldn't escape it. MGM handed the directing job to Fred M. Wilcox, who had no history with sci-fi. His biggest credit was Lassie Come Home. People raised eyebrows, but MGM wasn't looking for a visionary to reinvent the genre. They wanted a disciplined hand who could handle a big cast, big set, and tight schedule. Wilcox delivered. His outsider perspective made everything stranger in the best way. He didn't shoot it like a sci-fi film. He shot it like it was Shakespeare in space. There were no jokes, no nods to the audience, no winks at the camera. He treated it seriously. That gravity helped ground the surreal plot. He let the special effects breathe, but never lost focus on the human faces at the center of the story. The script went through a transformation under screenwriter Cyril Hume. He took Bloch and Adler's visual concept and sculpted it into something deeper. Freudian psychology started creeping in. The monsters became more than physical threats. They became symbols of repression and desire, drawn from the mind of Dr. Morbius himself. Hume didn't just write dialogue, he added layers: literary, psychological, mythological. The story had echoes of past trauma and fear of power, and the way knowledge itself could destroy you. It wasn't just about aliens, it was about the dark corners of the human soul, tucked behind a shining curtain of advanced machines. Walter Pidgeon was 58 years old when MGM asked him to play Dr. Morbius. He had spent decades playing dignified roles in prestige dramas. Sci-fi was not in his vocabulary. He nearly said no. What changed his mind wasn't the genre. It was the promise of a $1.9 million production and a script that mirrored The Tempest. Pidgeon saw the story had weight. It wasn't camp. It was cautionary. He took the part. And in doing so, he gave the film the seriousness it needed. He anchored the madness with restraint. Anne Francis, only 23, walked onto the set wearing what would later be called the first miniskirt in film. Her costumes, designed by Helen Rose, were shocking. They predated Mary Quant's fashion breakthrough by almost a decade. Executives were nervous. Spain banned the film until 1967. Conservative theaters backed out. But the look stuck. Barefoot, innocent, futuristic, Altaira became an icon, not just for her beauty, but for the way she defied expectations. Frances didn't just wear the future, she became part of it. Leslie Nielsen played Commander Adams, the serious, moral leader of the crew. Before he was ever known for comedy, he was the straight man. His presence in Forbidden Planet was commanding. He looked like he belonged on the bridge of a spaceship. His role foreshadowed what would later become Captain Kirk. Nielsen later joked that the real star was Robbie the robot, and in a way, he was right. Warren Stevens played Doc Ostro, the one who figured it out too late. His final words, monsters. Monsters from the ID landed like a hammer in 1956. Most audiences didn't even know what the id was, but they felt it. His character's death was off-screen, quiet, horrifying. He tried to use the Krell's ancient machine, and it broke him. Stevens delivered it all with a calm that made it worse. The monster wasn't out there. It was inside. Robbie the robot didn't speak for himself. Marvin Miller gave him his voice, but got no credit. Inside the suit was stuntman Frankie Darro. Darro lasted only so long. After a few drinks at lunch, he nearly fell over mid-scene and was let go. But the voice and the movement came together anyway, and Robbie became immortal. He wasn't just a machine. He had charm. He was a new kind of character, friendly, deadly, mysterious. The film's first premiere wasn't even in Hollywood. It was March 3rd and 4, 1956, at the Southeastern Science Fiction Convention in Charlotte. Hollywood came later, on March 23rd at Grauman's Chinese Theater. That kind of rollout was rare for a genre film. Most sci-fi stories premiered quietly, slipped into late-night showings. But Forbidden Planet opened big, with CinemaScope and stereophonic sound. It played for 6 months at Grauman's. MGM treated it like an epic. When the music credits rolled, they didn't say "score by." Instead, they called it Electronic Tonalities by Lewis and Baby Baron. The union rules wouldn't allow them to be credited as composers. The Barons didn't use instruments. They built circuits. They made music by breaking things: loops, feedback, static. Their work wasn't music by 1956 standards, but it changed the rules anyway. Reviews were mixed. Some critics didn't know what to make of it. The New Yorker thought it was a joke. British critics were kinder, but still puzzled. The Shakespeare, the psychology, the monsters, they didn't fit together easily. Some saw brilliance, others just saw robots and color. But the confusion didn't stop the film from growing in stature. It didn't need instant approval. It was built for the long game. The film pulled in $1.53 million in the US and Canada and $1.235 million overseas. That gave it just under $3 million in total, with a modest profit of $210,000. Not a bomb, but not the smash MGM had hoped for. It ranked as the 30th highest-grossing American film of 1956, respectable. But the numbers weren't the real story. What mattered came later. In 1957, it got a nomination for Best Special Effects at the 29th Academy Awards. It didn't win. The Ten Commandments took the prize. But Forbidden Planet didn't need the trophy. Its monster was drawn with light. Its skies were painted. Its effects were practical, handmade, strange. The award nomination was proof that something had shifted. In Forbidden Planet, there was once a scene that tried to explain something audiences never quite understood. It was quiet, symbolic, and unsettling. Around the 11th minute, Dr. Ostro pointed out something about Altaira and her tiger. He said only a virgin could tame a unicorn, and he saw something similar in the way Altaira could stroke and command a full-grown tiger without fear. That scene didn't make it into the final cut. MGM cut it clean. The motion picture production code at the time found the virgin unicorn metaphor too suggestive. The idea that a woman's sexual innocence gave her mystical power over animals? That wasn't something they could let reach theaters in 1956. When Altaira kisses Commander Adams for the first time, her tiger turns on her. It doesn't hesitate. The animal that once laid peacefully beside her now sees her as a threat. In the finished version of the film, there's no explanation. It looks like a random moment of violence, but it wasn't random. The deleted scene would have made it clear. That kiss, that one moment of romantic awakening, was the end of her power over the animal. Like in those old myths where the unicorn bolts the second innocence is gone. When the tiger lunges, it isn't just about danger. It's about change, loss, and something that can't be undone. For years, the only place that scene existed was in a book. The novelization of Forbidden Planet, written by Philip MacDonald under the name W.J. Stewart, was released in 1956, before the movie ever hit theaters. It kept the unicorn line. It spelled it out word for word, how Altaira's purity kept the tiger in check. Most people reading the book assumed it was just a creative flourish. They didn't know the scene had been filmed and then buried. For almost 20 years, nobody outside of MGM saw any evidence that it had ever been shot. MGM had a rule: destroy all work prints. They didn't want alternate versions of their movies floating around. They didn't want raw cuts leaking to the public. But somehow, Forbidden Planet slipped through. In 1977, the old work print turned up in a forgotten archive. It had the unicorn scene. It had different takes, alternate dialogue, raw sound. Nobody knows exactly why it was saved. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe someone couldn't bring themselves to burn it. But it survived. And when it resurfaced, it changed everything. That work print got restored. First, it showed up on a Criterion Laserdisc. Then on the 50th anniversary DVD. Then again on Blu-ray. Fans who had grown up watching the theatrical version finally saw what had been missing. The kiss, the tiger, the myth. It all clicked. Altaira wasn't just a space ingenue. She was a metaphor walking. Her story folded into layers of innocence, sexuality, and the invisible lines Hollywood wasn't ready to cross. And there was something else that sparked controversy in 1956. Altaira had a scene where she swam alone, floating through the water like something from a dream. It looked like she was nude. Word spread fast. Anne Francis on screen naked in a sci-fi movie. But she wasn't. She wore a skin-colored bodysuit. It was thin, seamless, carefully designed to look like bare skin under light and rippling water. The illusion worked too well. Audience members were outraged. Morality groups wrote angry letters. Some theaters pulled the film from their lineups. MGM had to issue public statements. They said no, Anne Francis was never nude. No, nothing indecent had happened. But people didn't buy it. They couldn't believe it was just lighting and angles. George Folsey, the cinematographer, had used precise lighting, kept shadows out of frame, avoided seams, and let water reflection hide the costume's edges. He turned a bodysuit into a scandal. Even the crew was shocked at how real it looked. MGM wanted to push boundaries without crossing the line. They found a way to do both. In 1972, when MGM tried to re-release the film as a kiddie matinee, they cut over 6 minutes. The swimming scene was gone. So were several flirtatious exchanges, anything too suggestive. The version that showed in theaters that year had a G rating, but it was missing what gave the movie its edge. For years, kids saw the tamed version. It wasn't until much later that audiences got to see the original, uncensored take again. Spain didn't allow the film at all. For over 10 years, Forbidden Planet was banned there. The Spanish censors under Franco took issue with Anne Francis's miniskirts and that swimming scene. It wasn't the words, or the monsters, or the spaceship. It was the costumes. Her skirts were too short, her body too visible. The film didn't screen in Spain until 1967. By then, it had already become a classic elsewhere. But in Spain, it was still considered dangerous. Anne Francis almost wore something even more modest. MGM's costume designer Helen Rose created a silver lame jumpsuit that covered her completely, from the neck down. It even came with a matching hood, silver gloves, and see-through shoes. But when Dor Shari, MGM's studio head, saw it, he said no. Too revealing, he said, too sexy. Even though it showed no skin at all, it was tight, it sparkled. That was enough to make it unacceptable. The jumpsuit was never filmed. Only costume test photos exist. Behind all the drama and metaphor was a technical feat most people never noticed. The painted desert in the background wasn't real. It was a 350-foot cyclorama, a curved painting hanging on stage 15. It looked like an alien landscape stretching out forever. But the lighting had to be exact. The sun painted on the background had to match the artificial sun used on set. If the angles didn't align, the illusion collapsed. Folsey lit that painting with 40 skylights, each with 10 1,000-watt bulbs, plus 96 K10s and 192 K5s, all drawing so much power they had to run extra lines from other stages. That one backdrop required a small army of electricians. Then came the spaceship. Arthur Lonergan designed a 51-meter flying saucer that filled the entire set. It was 167 feet across, the size of a real building. It overwhelmed the cast. MGM execs walked on set and immediately increased the budget. The film ended up costing $2 million. At the time, that was unheard of for a science fiction film, but the spaceship wasn't just a set. It was a commitment. It raised the stakes. It forced everyone to bring their best. 4 of MGM's largest sound stages were used. No other film had done that before. Each one held a different part of the world: the spaceship, the Krell laboratory, the control center, the alien terrain. The stages ran simultaneously. Crews worked in overlapping shifts, building, filming, and tearing down. It was a constant rotation. The demands were brutal, and the coordination had to be exact. This wasn't just another genre movie. It was a construction site wrapped around a vision of another world. Inside the spaceship, they built a 16-foot plexiglass globe. It had an outer and an inner shell with glowing steel bands running through them. It reflected everything: light, cameras, crew. Every single thing in the room bounced off that globe. To get one usable shot, they had to mask lights, cover equipment, hide people, block glare. It took hours just to set up one angle. The globe became a legend on set, a beautiful nightmare. Then came the Krell laboratory. It wasn't just wires and lights. It was 50,000 feet of cabling, 2,500 feet of neon tubing, and over 1,200 square yards of plexiglass. A crew of 15 electricians worked it. They used 110 separate switches to make panels blink, lights flash, circuits pulse like they were alive. The power demands were so high they had to run lines from other stages. And every switch mattered. They changed colors mid-scene. They adjusted pulses. It looked like alien intelligence, but it was just human grit. Everything in Forbidden Planet was bigger than it seemed. The missing scenes, the hidden metaphors, the costumes that caused riots, the sets that drained power grids. For a long time, people watched the film without knowing what they were missing. But those gaps, those quiet erasures, are what made its rediscovery feel like opening a locked room. In 1956, MGM poured $125,000 into building a single robot. That robot was Robbie. He wasn't some background gadget. He was the centerpiece. The cost ate up 7% of the entire $1.9 million budget for Forbidden Planet. Most sci-fi movies at the time couldn't even dream of that kind of money for their entire production. Adjusted for today's value, that's about $1.2 million. And all of it went into something that didn't breathe, blink, or speak on its own. But Robbie didn't just stand there. He moved, blinked, spun, and spoke with lights flashing and gears turning. His head was a plexiglass dome. Inside, there were rotating spheres, gyros, and pilot lights. Everything moved in rhythm, as if he was alive. Actor Frankie Darro was the first person to get strapped inside. It wasn't glamorous. The robot was 7 feet tall, packed with metal and rubber, and the inside was pitch black, sweltering, and suffocating. There was no ventilation, and the head was partially electrified. Frankie once tried filming a scene after a few martinis and almost toppled the robot. The studio wasn't amused. Every step he took was torture. Every movement drained him. And all that pain? It never even showed on screen. Even after the film, Robbie wasn't done. MGM needed to make back their money, so they sent him everywhere. He got his own starring role in The Invisible Boy in 1957. Then he became a go-to guest in shows like The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, Columbo, The Addams Family, The Love Boat, and even Mork and Mindy. He was a walking Easter egg, a relic that kept reappearing. Sometimes he had new paint, sometimes new wires. But the silhouette never changed. He even shared the screen with Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes, back in action in 2003. It wasn't a cameo career, it was a second life. People called him the hardest working robot in Hollywood. But Robbie was more than metal. He had rules. Dr. Morbius, the character who built him, gave him strict orders that lined up with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. No harming humans, obey orders, protect himself, but never at the cost of the other 2 rules. These rules shaped the story. When the invisible id monster attacks, Robbie refuses to fight. His circuits lock. He's frozen. Because deep down, he knows the monster is part of Morbius. If he attacks the monster, he attacks his own master. It was one of the first times a movie robot followed not just commands, but ethics. And it changed sci-fi forever. That wasn't the only thing Forbidden Planet did first. Its soundtrack wasn't made with violins or trumpets. It was made with circuits. Louis and Baby Baron didn't use instruments. They used self-built machines. No strings, no keys, just raw voltage and sound. It was the first movie to have a fully electronic score. It wasn't background music. It was the atmosphere, the mood, the tension. The Barons didn't even call it music. They called it electronic tonalities, because the American Federation of Musicians wouldn't let them call it music. The union said if humans didn't play it with traditional instruments, it didn't count. So even after creating something revolutionary, the Barons got second-tier credit. The process was brutal. The circuits they built weren't reusable. Each one had its own sound, personality, and lifespan. When a circuit finally overloaded and died, they recorded that final sound. That death cry became part of the score. Baby Baron then had to sort through hundreds of tape fragments, cutting and splicing by hand. No undo button, no software, just tape, blades, and hours of repetition. She later called it a terrible job, but without her, the sounds would have been lost. Each fragment was unique. Nothing could be recreated. Their approach wasn't just experimental, it was philosophical. Inspired by Norbert Wiener's theory of cybernetics, the Barons saw machines as more than tools. They saw them as organisms, alive in their own way. The circuits responded to feedback. They adapted. They changed with time. Each one had a beginning, a middle, and an end. That belief turned their machines into co-creators. Every beep and screech was a moment of life, captured before the circuit burned out. While the score whispered and buzzed, the monster on screen roared. The id monster wasn't a man in a suit. It was hand-animated by Joshua Meador, a Disney veteran. Every frame was drawn on translucent vellum, frame by frame. It took months. The monster was just a fiery outline, barely visible unless it passed through the ship's force field. It was eerie, threatening, and untraceable. State censors thought it was too terrifying. Some demanded edits. That kind of pushback was rare for an invisible creature. But this one hit a nerve. Maybe because it wasn't a thing. It was an idea. The idea was Freud. The monster wasn't just a threat. It was the subconscious itself. The id. The unfiltered rage and lust and fear that lives under every mind. Morbius didn't know he was creating it. He thought the ancient Krell machine was safe, but it read his thoughts. And not just the ones he admitted to, the ones he buried, the ones he didn't even understand. And those thoughts became weapons. The Krell had built machines that turned thought into reality, powered by more than 9,000 thermonuclear reactors buried underground. But they never thought to limit the machine. So when their own subconscious fears took shape, the Krell died. All of them. In a single night. The same thing nearly happened again. Morbius used the Krell tech, and when his jealousy flared, the monster returned. That's why Robbie couldn't stop it. That's why the guns didn't work. They were trying to fight someone's mind. The monster was Morbius. And his pain, his desire, his denial, it all made the monster stronger. Even Altaira wasn't safe. Morbius's daughter became the center of it all. Her innocence, her growing romance with Commander Adams, it pulled on something inside Morbius. Something twisted. He never said it out loud. But when Altaira kissed another man, the monster screamed. Morbius didn't summon it. He was it. His subconscious fought for control. The jealousy, the possessiveness, the rage, it manifested in the most Freudian way. Film critics later pointed out the incestuous undertones. The monster didn't want to harm Altaira. It wanted to protect her from everyone else. And the person it hurt most in the end was Morbius himself.